Hello everyone, and welcome to another Strategoy video. This one's a bit special, because so far we've only done guides on how to play Lumineth. Today we're taking a look at how to play against Lumineth. This video will be most beneficial to all players facing off against the Realm-Lords, but I strongly believe it will help Lumineth players as well. After all, knowing the weaknesses of your army is part of being a great general. We've divided this guide into 5 parts. We'll look at the most important army rules first, then check out the Lumineth playstyle and common builds you might see. From those builds, we'll analyze the major threats. Subsequently, I want to talk a little on having the right attitudes to beat Lumineth and basically any army in the game. We'll end the video with a recap for everyone who likes a refresher or doesn't want to watch the entire guide. The Lumineth Realm-Lords are a rules-heavy army. It takes a great mind to manage them all, and it takes an even greater mind to manage them all while playing a different army. We've selected the most crucial rules you need to remember and the ones you'll come across most often. First of which are the Aether Quartz reserves. All Lumineth units, so even heroes and monsters, have one Aether Quartz reserve. They can spend this reserve at certain points during the battle to get a short boost to their effectiveness. Once used though, it's gone, and the unit suffers a permanent -1 to bravery. There's 4 benefits they can choose from. They can add 1 to their saves when they're targeted in the shooting or the fight phase, or they can add 1 to hits in any of those phases. During the hero phase, after rolling to cast, they can choose to add 1 to their roll, or even completely reroll it. They could also opt to cast an extra spell, but they can only do this at the start of the hero phase. It is useful to know that there's a nation that gives them 2 reserves instead of 1, and that there's a hero that can remove the bravery penalty. More on that hero in the threat section. One of their stronger melee buffs is the lightning reactions rule. When you and your opponents alternate between fighting with a unit in the fight phase, Lumineth armies can choose to activate 2 units, instead of 1 during each activation. The one rule that makes Lumineth a very potent army though, is the one that's only on a couple of war scrolls. Those units are the core of any Lumineth force, so it is important to understand it well. When a unit has a Sun Metal Weapons rule, unmodified hit rolls of 6 inflict a mortal wound instead of normal damage, which is obviously quite strong. Thanks to a spell that's cast on a 6+, Lumineth players can even improve their weapons to mortal wounding on hits of 5 rather than 6. Those same units are also Vanari units, which is a sub-allegiance within the Lumineth book. All Vanari units can be deployed as a Shining Company, effectively making them -1 to hit while they remain in this formation. To do so though, all models need to touch bases of at least 2 other models in the same unit. They can also not run or charge while in a Shining Company and can only pile in 1 inch. The next rule comes up a lot less frequently, but in certain army builds it's one of the most crucial rules that there is, so I felt it was necessary to cover it anyway. Move Like the Wind is a rule that only Hurricane units benefit from. Those are the Kangaroos, the Wind Foxes and the Mage on his Cloud, by the way. They can fly during the pile-in move and move an extra 3 inches. They also don't have to move towards the closest units, which is huge, as they could just as well use those 6 inches to move out of combat completely. Pair this with activating 2 units in the combat phase, and it will be really difficult to inflict any damage in melee when the Hurricane units don't feel like taking it. The last bullet point is not so much a rule as it is a characteristic of the book. The Lumineth are famous for their amazing magic, and I wanted to highlight certain key spells that might come up. Power of Hysh is a spell we've already touched on. It improves the Sun Metal weapons so that they inflict mortals on 5s to hit rather than 6 to hit. It will be key to unbind this spell when it's being cast on 30 sentinels, for example. Speed of Fish can be really strong as well, as it effectively doubles your movement characteristic. This is handy to get into melee range quicker, or out of it of course, but it's especially potent when used to capture objectives. When it's cast on their cavalry, for example, they can move 24 inches without running or charging. Protection of Fish is the most important spell to unbind when you are planning to put on some hurt. It gives a 5-up ward save to units wholly within 9 inches of the caster. Remember that it is wholly within and not just within, so you could catch certain players out during the pile-in step. Total Eclipse is more of a nuisance in certain turns, but it can be game-changing when you're not ready for it. When spending command points on a command ability, every command costs 1 more. This effect persists until their next hero phase, so this could affect you for quite a long time. The last spell, Howling Gale, is a bit of an odd one, as it can only be used by Techless or Wind Mages, so you won't see it as often as the other ones. That doesn't make it less dangerous though. It targets an enemy unit, and until the next Lumineth hero phase, that unit cannot be the target for command abilities. This is huge, as it takes away commands like All Out Defense and Inspiring Presence. When it comes to playstyle, it is easy to divide the Realm-Lords in 2 categories. Hence, there's only 2 competitive builds we have to discuss. Before we do that though, we'll take a look at their all-around strengths and weaknesses. We covered some of their strengths already. There's a ton of wizards in the army and they have a lot of strong spells. Hardly any of those spells are direct damage though, as they focus more on debuffing your units or buffing their own. That's why we call it a toolbox army, as a really good Lumineth player can find a solution for most problems. Lastly, their best units have a high mortal wound output, thanks to the sun metal weapons. Some of those strengths play into their weaknesses as well though. They tend to castle up quite a lot, because they want their buff spells to be in range. This makes it easier for you to gain control of the board. They're also quite fragile once you really lay into them. Of course, the Shining Company debuffs help them out, but all dedicated damage units will wipe out any Lumineth unit on the table normally. Lastly, their effectiveness so far has been built upon 2 or 3 core units and abilities. Think of the Sentinel Archer builds or the 4 Wind Spirits. It can be frustrating to face off against these at first, but remember that that's it. There is not much else to those lists than that, so every time you face off against them, you're basically preparing yourself for the next battle as well. We'll take a closer look at those 2 builds right now, so that you don't have to go in blind. The first build is the Vanari Castle, and it is more or less the exact same list every time, with very minor alterations. Its centerpiece is Techless, the Lumineth God Mage. He knows all 18 spells from the book, has 2 of his own, and knows the spells from the general rulebook as well. You can imagine how that might play out in battle. Techless always has a trick or 2 up his sleeve, but he does die quite easily. He's usually accompanied by another hero, like a Cathaller, or, more often, a Lord Regent. This is a buff piece that increases the chance of buffing the mortal wound output on their archers. Those archers are Sentinels, and they are one of those core units you'll see show up in almost any list. You will see at least 20 of them in all competitive lists, but usually it'll be 30. They're protected by screening units, like Wardens, who can also serve as objective grabbers. That leaves a Lumineth player with an amount of points that may be enough to either take another small unit, like Dawnrider Cavalry, or an endless spell, like the Emerald Life Swarm. When playing against this type of army, I'd advise 3 things. First of all, if possible, try to alpha strike them. Teclis has a lot of buffs to dole out, and if you can damage them before he does dole out his buffs, you'll find it way easier to defeat them, and it will affect the outcome of the battle. You'll also have to break through their screens to reach the heart of the castle. Both Teclis and Sentinels die to almost anything, so if you can reach them with a good melee unit, you'll probably win. You could of course just rain down hell with a ranged unit and leave the screens as is. I'd also recommend bringing some strong unbinds. Choose heroes that have an auto unbind, or at least have a bonus to unbind rolls. Being able to unbind certain key spells, like Power of Fish or Protection of Teclis, will help you immensely. As we said before, there's really only two competitive builds right now. One was a Venari build, the other is focused on the Wind Spirits, who are foxes that zip around the battlefield. Armies like this will be led by a Wind Mage, as he can heal the foxes when he's close to them. You can then expect up to 4 Wind Spirits. One of them will be the hero version. These 4 models form the core of this kind of army. They are incredibly fast, as they can move in the movement phase and in all shooting phases as well. They're Hurricane units, so on top of that, they pile in 6 inches. This enables them to zone out your units with their threat range, effectively blocking you from taking objectives or making charges, since they'll move out of the way before you can catch them. The rest of this list is somewhat a filler. Usually, you'll see 20 Sentinels and 2 screens of 10 Wardens as their battle line. There are variations on this build though. Sometimes you only see 3 Foxes and more Wardens and Sentinels. Or you'll see a mix of all kinds of units. But once you're prepared for the list on your screen right now, you can take on any variation in the same way. Begin by bringing a lot of firepower, as that's the only way to reliably kill the Wind Spirits. They cannot be charged unless you completely surround them, which will be amazingly difficult. Also try to grab objectives early, as they won't be able to zone you out of them. Lastly, you'll have the advantage once you can outmaneuver them. Think Stormcast or Living City Deep Strike, or very fast units like Dragons or Maw Crushes. From these 2 builds, we can conclude that there are 4 major threat pieces you need to prepare for. In competitive lists, you will hardly ever see them all in one list, but you'll always see at least one. Number 1 is the big boy himself, Teclis and Selenar, his Moon Spirit companion. As stated before, he's a major toolbox piece that doesn't ramp up damage as much as it buffs his own units or hampers yours. When facing Teclis, try to unbind key spells, like Protection of Teclis, which is a massive 18-inch aura that gives a 5+ ward save to all Lumineth units wholly within it. He will die to any type of damage though, but he'll be protected by screens of pikemen, so your best bet is shooting him down, preferably with an Alpha Strike unit like Bow Snakes from the Daughters of Cain or Stormcast Long Strikes. The next big threat is the one you've probably heard of the most, and that's the Venari Sentinels. They are tough to deal with if you're not ready for them, as they have 30-inch range on their bows, ignore line of sight and inflict mortal wounds. You'll want to unbind Power of Fish on them before you do anything else. This greatly reduces their damage. Try to unbind spells that let them reroll their hits as well. If you can get them in melee, charge them with a chaff unit first to soak up Unleash Hell, or simply pile in of them of course. As their main damage comes from mortals, you'll find ward saves immensely valuable when facing Sentinels or Lumineth as a whole. The Cathalar is another key synergy piece in a lot of lists. We've not covered her much so far because she's specifically strong when paired with Venari units and not Teclis. she has a spell that forces you to pass bravery checks whenever you want to move, shoot, charge or fight. So definitely unbind that. Or simply stay outside of 18 inches, as this will outrange both that spell and her other abilities. I would advise trying to kill her off early, as she synergizes very well with Vanari units. She can absorb their bravery penalty from using Aether Quartz and ping it back to your units. Or she might even worsen a bravery check for you, adding the losses of a Lumineth unit to your roll instead of their own. The last big threat are the Wind Spirits, or the named hero Severeth. They move 12 inches in any shooting phase, so charging them is almost impossible. Shoot them down instead, as they are quite fragile. Also, don't let them box you in if you're facing multiple Wind Spirits. Lastly, remember that objectives win games more often than killing units, so prioritize those over hunting the foxes if you've got no ranged units to deal with them. Our last subject is a bit of an odd one, as it can be applied to any games, not just the ones against Lumineth Realm-Lords. I found it important to include it in this video though, as Lumineth get a really bad rep from the internet. Their abilities used to catch people off guard, which resulted in huge amounts of salt and online whining. Complaining online might be a good way to let off some steam, but the game suffers for it as a whole. It increases the negativity at the table even before armies have been set up, and negativity always reduces your chances to win. That's why I want to focus on 4 core values that you need to bring to the table before anything else. The first one is optimism. Remember, you can always win. It is a dice game after all. Even when things seem dire, finish your games and try to have fun even when you're losing. Also, remember that getting outplayed or outmaneuvered doesn't make you a bad player. The Lumineth book is filled with rules upon rules upon rules, so it's natural to forget certain abilities and be caught out. Just stay open-minded and learn from it. That's why it's important to accept whatever happens. You will be surprised, and certain units will be better than yours, and vice versa. Remember that it's a dice game, and that it affects you just as much as your opponent. Sometimes you will roll poorly for an entire game, or more likely, it will feel like it. Don't start complaining about it to your opponent. It sours their victory and the game as a whole. Besides, you'll learn more from losing anyway. When you begin a game, try to change up your objective. You're gonna spend several hours playing another person. So make fun and learning your main objectives. Winning is fantastic, but if that's the deciding factor on whether you had a good time or not, you're gonna waste a lot of hours in this hobby. Also, remember that for every loss, you've gained knowledge. So learning now means winning more later. And last of all, be flexible. Adjust your plans. Use knowledge from videos like this one and pair it with your experience. Repeat certain strategies before you discard them, so that you have made sure you're not throwing away good tactics. And if it turns out that they're not working for you, then adapt. Try something new in the moment when you're sure you're gonna lose otherwise. And that brings us to the final part of this video. You can skip this if you've watched the entire thing, or maybe you fast forwarded to this point and are eager to quickly pick up some tips and tricks. Well, in that case, try to bring some ward saves and strong ranged firepower before anything else. You will need to protect your army from mortal wounds, and good ranged units allow you to destroy Lumineth key pieces. Good unbinding is also pertinent, as certain spells can be game changing. Avoid bringing small heroes that you would rely on otherwise. Since Lumineth Sentinels can easily deal with small heroes, you'll find yourself without your synergies after a turn or two. Don't bring too many slow units either, as you'll want to engage the Lumineth as soon as possible. If you're bringing a list where your entire concept relies on one threat, you're bound to lose, as deleting one unit at a time is something the Realm-Lords excel at. If you're not sure what to kill first, focus Techless, Sentinels or Wind Spirits. Probably in that order, depending on whether you're sure you can kill Techless in one turn. Finally, come prepared. Read up on their rules, learn from previous games or, watch our videos. Stay optimistic and don't fall into the trap of bad-mouthing your opponent's army. Remain eager to learn, as learning now means winning later. And that's where we'll leave you. This was quite a lengthy guide, but there was a lot to cover, and we don't half-ass things here on the Strategoid channel. We hope you've enjoyed this video and that you'll leave a like if you have. Feel free to share and subscribe, as it helps us out to keep videos like this coming. Let us know in the comments what videos you'd like us to make next. We read all your feedback and use it to improve further content. Thanks again for watching and have fun facing off against the brightest elves in the game.